There's a secret I've kept tucked away in the back of my repair shop, hidden inside an old grandfather clock where no one would ever think to look. For 18 months, I've sat on a truth that could level my family to the ground, waiting for the exact moment the gears would finally turn. You see, I've spent my life fixing time, but I never expected I'd have to use it as a tool to protect my son from the woman he loves. Stay with me, because this story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. The breaking point. My son, Daniel, never had a clue about what I'd stashed inside that old grandfather clock at the back of my shop. When he tied the knot with a woman who looked at my life's work and saw nothing but dollar signs and a line item on a spreadsheet, I knew I had to keep a close watch. I started documenting every single move she made. One quiet afternoon, my shop assistant's voice crackled from the back room, sounding hushed and frantic. She told me, "Mr. Callaway, you'd better get back here. Your daughter-in-law is in your office digging through your personal desk." That was the moment I'd been bracing for over the last year and a half. Everything I'd quietly put in place was about to flip my family's future upside down. I'm real glad you're here to listen to this. But before I dive into what went down that afternoon, do me a favor. If you believe that real love sometimes means shielding the people you care about from the absolute worst versions of themselves, drop a comment with the word protect. A legacy in the quiet. There's a specific brand of silence that rolls into a watch shop once the last customer pulls the door shut. It's not the kind of quiet you find in an empty room. It's more like a held breath, heavy with anticipation. Every single gear and spring on those shelves is just sitting there, waiting for a pair of hands to give it a reason to tick again. Over 38 years, I've developed an ear for it. I can tell you the difference between a clock that's just run out of steam and one that's actually taking its final breath. Those sounds. They aren't the same at all. I'm Victor Hale. I'm 64 years old, and most folks around Asheville, North Carolina, know me as that guy on Lexington Avenue who can breathe life back into a dead timepiece. Callaway Clock and Watch Repair has been in the same narrow brick building since 1989. The window still has that hand-lettered sign my wife, Miriam, painted herself the year we opened up. She used real gold leaf and a tiny brush she'd special ordered from an art catalog. It took her 3 whole days to get those letters perfect, and I haven't touched a single flake of it since. Inside these walls, it's about more than just stock and parts. It's about memory. I've got pocket watches with shattered glass and mantel clocks with chimes that have lost their tune. Grandkids bring in their grandparents' old watches, wanting to keep a piece of them ticking even after they're gone. Every worn-out gear or stripped crown tells me a story. Most people think my job is fixing clocks, but what I'm really doing is refusing to let time quit on the things that actually matter. The ghost in the gears. My actual workspace is tucked in the back, separated from the front counter by a beaded curtain Miriam picked up at a craft fair back in '94. She always said it gave the place some character, while I joked that it made me feel like I was walking into a fortune-teller's tent every time I went to work. She got a real kick out of that one for a long time. Miriam's been gone 8 years now. Ovarian cancer, stage 4. We found out in October, and by February, she was gone. Those were the fastest, most gut-wrenching 5 months I've ever lived through. She was only 57, with a whole lot of living left to do. When she passed, she left me plenty to hold on to. The shop, the lease, and a ledger of customers that goes back 20 years. I've still got her gold leaf brush wrapped up in a cloth in the top drawer of her desk. She also left me our son, Daniel. At 26, he was already turning into the kind of man she would have been proud of. And then there was the clock. It wasn't just some random piece, it was an English bracket clock from around 1880, encased in fruitwood with a brass dial that still shows the Roman numerals. She'd picked it up at an estate sale and spent 3 weekends fixing it up herself. That was strange for her since she was a bookkeeper by trade, not a tinkerer. She told me she just wanted to understand what I loved so much about the work. Just 2 days before she went into the hospital for the final time, She brought that clock into the shop and put it on the shelf right above my workbench. She didn't offer much of an explanation. She just fixed me with those steady gray eyes of hers and said, "Arthur, this stays here. When the moment comes, you'll know exactly what to do." I figured she was just hazy from the morphine, so I just smiled and promised to keep it safe. It took me a long, long time to figure out what she really meant. The new addition. Now Daniel was a good kid. I want to be real clear about that because things are about to get messy, and I don't want his character to get lost in the shuffle. He grew into a solid man, honest, hard-working, the kind of guy who remembers your name and shows up when the chips are down. He's a structural engineer here in Asheville. He's got a knack for both numbers and people, which isn't a combination you see every day. After we lost Miriam, he was at my place every Sunday for breakfast, helping me with heavy deliveries when my back acted up. He never once brought up the money or the will. He just wanted to be there. I really thought I'd raised him right. Then, about 3 years back, Daniel met Vanessa Reed at some work function. She was 31, sharp as a tack, and worked in real estate development. When he brought her by the shop that April, he had that proud look on his face that young men get when they think they found something the rest of the world missed out on. She was attractive, but in a way that felt very calculated, the kind of look that takes a lot of work to make seem effortless. She shook my hand with both of hers and called the shop absolutely charming. But when I looked at her eyes, she wasn't seeing charm. She was doing the math. I've seen that look on estate appraisers and probate lawyers. It's the look of someone who's already mentally dividing a room into columns before they even know what's inside. I tried to brush it off, wanting to believe I was just being a cynical old man who needed to give people a fair shake. The mask slips. They were engaged by December and married the following September at a vineyard outside town. Daniel broke down when he saw her walking down the aisle, and I did too, mostly because it hurt that Miriam wasn't there to see it. For those first few months, I tried to convince myself I'd been wrong about her. She seemed to make my son happy, and she had the kind of drive and social grace that a shy kid like Daniel really needs in a partner. But 5 months in, the vibe changed. It started with these casual questions. She'd ask how long I'd owned the building, what the property values were looking like on Lexington, or if I'd looked into retirement programs for small business owners. She asked the way someone asks when they already have the data and are just checking to see if you'll tell the truth. I kept my answers short and careful. I told her the building had treated us well, that I wasn't looking to sell, and that the plan was always for Daniel to take over the legacy one day if he wanted it. Courtney just smiled and called that sweet. You know, when someone calls a 38-year life plan sweet, it's usually not a compliment. It's a dismissal. And that was the moment I realized the clock wasn't just ticking for my business, it was ticking for my family. By the time March rolled around, I could see the light fading out of my son's eyes during our Sunday mornings together. He was quieter, more distant, and he couldn't seem to keep his eyes off his phone. The first time I asked him if everything was okay, he just brushed it off, saying he was exhausted. 2 weeks later, I asked again. That time he told me Courtney thought he was putting in too many hours at work. She wanted them to start using their weekends more intentionally. More intentionally? I asked. I'd never heard my son use a word like that in my life. He wouldn't even look at me when he answered. He said it was about planning activities and making the most of their time. I knew exactly what was happening without him saying a word. She was slowly tightening the leash, pulling him into her world and pushing him out of mine, one Sunday at a time. The visits started getting thin, then they became rare, and eventually they were replaced by text messages. We both knew a text isn't the same as a conversation, but we both pretended it was enough. The challenging sign in April, my shop assistant, Patricia Cole, pulled me aside. She's been running the front counter for 11 years, and she only calls me Mr. Callaway when the news is bad. She told me Courtney had stopped by the day before while I was out picking up parts. Courtney claimed she just wanted to look around for the sake of nostalgia, but Gloria wasn't buying it. How long was she in the back? I asked. About 12 minutes, Gloria said. I walked into the back room and took a look around. To a stranger, nothing looked out of place, but I know every inch of that shop like the back of my own hand. My invoice box was sitting slightly crooked. The file drawer was open about half an inch more than I ever leave it. Someone had been digging through my life, and I didn't need a magnifying glass to know who. I didn't say a word to Daniel. Not yet. I didn't have the proof I needed, and I wasn't about to start a fire I couldn't put out. Bringing in the professionals. Instead of starting a fight, I called a man named Ethan Brooks. He's a former deputy who works as a private investigator now. A customer had given me his card years ago during a legal dispute, and I'd kept it tucked in my ledger just in case. We met at the shop after I'd locked up for the evening. Marcus is a methodical, quiet man, the kind of guy who doesn't waste breath on small talk. He sat there at my workbench and listened to the whole story without saying a word. When I was done, he only had 4 questions. Where was the shop located? Did Daniel have access to my bank accounts? Had Courtney asked about the will? And did I have a lawyer? I gave him the facts. No, Daniel didn't have my passwords. Courtney hadn't asked about the will directly, not yet. And as for a lawyer, I've had Jonathan Pierce in my corner for nearly 20 years. Marcus nodded and told me he'd start his surveillance on Monday. That same week, I got on the phone with Robert. I told him the air was starting to smell like rain, and I wanted to be under a roof when the storm hit. We updated my will that month, and he restructured my trust so that my property and accounts wouldn't just pass over automatically. They were now tied to very specific conditions. He told me to start keeping a log of every strange conversation or event. I went down to the stationery store on Wall Street and bought a small, dark green notebook. My first entry was April 14th. I've written in it every single week since. The mask falls off. What Marcus dug up over the next couple of months didn't really surprise me, but seeing it on paper made it real. Courtney had been meeting with a real estate attorney named Lauren Bishop, someone who specializes in big commercial flips. They weren't meeting at an office either. They were hiding out in downtown cafes to avoid leaving a paper trail. Marcus even caught wind of a couple of phone calls where Courtney was discussing my shop and the timeline of my estate with someone he hadn't identified yet. In June, I got a front row seat to that timeline. I'd driven over to Daniel and Courtney's place for a cookout. I showed up 40 minutes early, something I never do, and Daniel was out back by the grill. As I walked around the side gate, I heard Courtney's voice through the open kitchen window. It was a challenge-em day, and she was clearly mid-conversation. "I don't know how much longer we're talking about, Paige," she said. I froze. He's 64, he's on blood pressure meds, and he spends all day alone in a basement. I'm not being morbid, I'm being a realist. Eventually, this property is going to become a decision. There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. "Yes," Courtney continued. "Daniel knows we have to think about the future. He just needs a little more time to come around to the idea." I stood there behind that gate for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Then, I turned around, walked back to my car, and called Marcus. I gave him the lawyer's name and told him I needed every scrap of documentation he could find. 2 weeks later, he delivered. Lauren Bishop had already drafted a proposal to sell my building on Lexington Avenue, contingent on the ownership changing hands. Courtney was listed as the transitional contact. My son's name wasn't anywhere on that document. The secret in the clock. I want to tell you something now that I haven't breathed a word of to anyone but my lawyer and the investigator. The night I read that proposal, I sat in the back of my shop for 3 hours with the lights off. I wasn't just heartbroken, though I was thinking about my late wife, Miriam. I wondered what she knew back then, and if she'd seen this coming long before I did. I looked at that bracket clock she'd left me, sitting there on the shelf in the dark. I'd never opened the case since the day she died. But that night, something pushed me to pick it up. I started examining the fruitwood case and the brass dial, and I noticed something I'd missed for years. Miriam had built a false floor into the bottom of the case. It was a beautiful piece of walnut veneer held in place by two tiny brass clips. When I pressed them together, the floor popped up. Inside, tucked into a plastic sleeve to keep it safe from the elements, was a letter written in Miriam's steady, careful hand. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything she wrote in that letter. Some things are meant to stay between a man and his wife, but what she said changed everything I thought I knew about the path ahead of me. I realized then that Miriam hadn't just left me a clock. She'd left me a roadmap for a challenge she knew I'd have to fight. A lot of what Miriam wrote in that letter was meant for my eyes only, the kind of private things a husband and wife share after decades together. But there was one part that changed everything, a part I'll never forget. It turns out she'd seen the red flags of Courtney's ambition way back at the engagement dinner. Miriam wasn't one to just sit back and hope for the best. She'd done her own homework. She'd talked to people, asked the right questions, and kept her ears open. She wrote that while she couldn't be 100% sure, she had a gut feeling I needed to be ready for trouble. Right there in the bottom of that clock she'd left her own trail of breadcrumbs. Account numbers, names, and even a record of a legal mess Courtney was involved in 4 years earlier regarding another estate. Then she wrote something that hit me like a ton of bricks. Arthur, you have a gift for fixing broken things. But some things aren't broken yet. They're just heading in the wrong direction. Watch for the signs. Protect what we built. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. I just sat there with those pages in my hand for the longest time. My wife had been looking out for me from the past. She'd tucked a survival kit into a clock she restored with her own hands and put it right above my workbench 8 years before I'd ever need it. She just trusted that I'd be smart enough to find it when the pressure got high. I took all that evidence and added it to my own pile. Then I folded her letter back up, tucked it away, and closed the clock. If you're still hanging in there with me, do me a favor and drop the number 1 in the comments so I know you're listening. The long game. The next few months were a masterclass in patience. I didn't even know I had it in me to stay that calm. While Marcus kept digging and my lawyer, Robert, tightened up my legal armor, I watched Courtney like I watch a clock with a skip in its gear. I knew the hitch was there. I was just waiting for it to show its face. I started noticing the way she was working on Daniel. She was too smart to just tell him to stay away from me. Instead, she'd plant little seeds. She'd mention that I seemed controlling about the shop, or suggest that his relationship with me was stopping them from forming their own identity as a couple. She even used Miriam's memory as a tool, making sweet comments about how hard it must be for Daniel to live up to his mother's legacy. I didn't hear this from her, of course. I heard it in bits and pieces from Daniel during our talks. He'd use phrases that didn't sound like him or show a hesitation that wasn't there before. I wrote every bit of it down in that green notebook, not because I was building a case against my son, but because I needed to document how someone was systematically rewriting who he was. The confrontation. By September, 14 months into their marriage, the weight of it finally broke. Daniel called me on a Tuesday night, his voice sounding flat and rehearsed. He said, "Dad, I think we need to talk about the shop." The next morning, he sat at my workbench just like he did when he was a kid. He looked exhausted, like he'd dropped 10 pounds of spirit. He told me Courtney thought it was time I looked into retirement. He said the shop was too much for one person and that with Lexington Avenue property values skyrocketing. I stopped him right there. I told him, "Daniel, don't give me the script she wrote for you. Talk to me like my son." He went quiet, his jaw tight. Then he admitted she saw the shop as an unutilized asset. I reminded him it was his mother's legacy, and for a second the fog cleared. I saw my boy again, guilty, confused, and drowning in someone else's logic. He whispered that he didn't want to lose the shop, but she just made everything sound so reasonable. I leaned in and told him to give me 3 weeks. I told him there were things happening he didn't know about yet, and I needed him to trust me the way his mother did. He didn't love the secrecy, but he agreed. The final straw. Those 3 weeks were when the trap finally snapped shut. Marcus got a recording of Courtney talking to her lawyer about the shop as a sale-ready asset. But the part that turned my blood to ice was when Courtney mentioned my blood pressure medication. She'd been using a contact at the insurance office to track my health records, waiting for me to trip up so she could make her move. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. Gloria caught Courtney sneaking into the back of the shop while I was out on a call. Courtney claimed she was picking something up for Daniel, but she spent 14 minutes alone in my office. Little did she know, I'd put a small camera above my workbench the week before. That night, I watched the footage of her digging through my insurance files and taking pictures with her phone. She even stopped and stared at that bracket clock for 30 seconds, picking it up and turning it over. She never found the false floor, but she'd seen enough. I called my lawyer right then and told him, "It's time." I reached out to Daniel on Friday and set up a dinner at the Montford rooftop, a place we only go for the big milestones. Just the 3 of us. I told him I was ready to talk about the future of the estate. He told me Courtney was excited to attend. I bet she was. The morning of that dinner, I sat in Robert's office and went over everything. The updated will, the recordings, the surveillance, and the evidence of her illegal snooping. We were ready. The clock was about to strike 12, and Courtney had no idea the alarm was set for her. Robert had gone the extra mile. He'd coordinated with another attorney, a colleague of his, who agreed to hang out at the restaurant bar that night. He was there just in case we needed a neutral legal witness to everything that was about to go down. Before I headed out, I looked Robert square in the eye and asked him one last time if we were truly ready. He gave me that heavy, certain look lawyers give when they know they've got the winning hand. "Arthur," he told me, "everything is exactly where it needs to be." I went back to my shop, opened the clock one final time, and read Miriam's letter slowly, letting every word sink in. When I was finished, I folded it up and tucked it into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. That letter wasn't for public consumption. It belonged to me, but I wanted her spirit sitting right there next to my heart tonight. The empty seat at the table. At 7 o'clock sharp, I walked into the Montford rooftop. I was wearing my best gray suit and carrying that bracket clock, carefully wrapped in canvas, under my arm. Daniel was already sitting there looking stiff and quiet. Courtney was right across from him, looking as sharp as a new razor and dressed like a woman who expected to be handed a check by the end of the night. She gave me one of those practiced challenge-em smiles when I took my seat. "Arthur," she chirped, "this was such a lovely idea. It's so important to get these things organized for the future." "You're absolutely right," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's exactly why we're here." We made some small talk while we ordered. Daniel was watching me like he was waiting for a doctor to deliver some bad news, while Courtney ordered a glass of champagne to celebrate the occasion. Once the main course was cleared away, I didn't wait any longer. I unwrapped the clock and set it right in the middle of the table. Courtney stared at it for a second. "Is that Miriam's clock?" "It is," I told her. "She spent the year before she passed away restoring this herself. She told me to keep it at the shop and said I'd know exactly when the time came to use it." Courtney let out a soft, dismissive laugh. "That's lovely, Arthur. A bit sentimental, isn't it?" "My wife was a careful woman," I replied, leaning in. "She saw things most people missed, and she made sure to prepare for them. She actually left me a letter in a hidden compartment she built with her own hands." The smile on Courtney's face didn't disappear, but it shifted. It got a little tighter around the edges. I opened the case, hit the brass clips to release the false floor, and pulled out the evidence. I didn't show her the letter. That was private. Instead, I laid out Marcus's full report, the dates of her secret meetings with Lauren Bishop, the records of her snooping through my insurance, and the transcript of that recorded phone call. The clock strikes 12. "Courtney," I said, my voice low and level, "you should probably take a real close look at these. My lawyer has the originals, and so does the insurance commission." Daniel reached out and grabbed the papers. I watched the color drain from his face as he read. "You've been coordinating with a real estate lawyer to sell my property behind my back," I continued. "You've been illegally digging through my private health records. You told your attorney you were just waiting for the timing of the transfer, meaning my death, and you even broke into my office 2 weeks ago to photograph my files." Courtney set her glass down with a sharp clack. "Arthur, I think you got this all wrong. You're taking things out of context. I was only trying to—" "Courtney." Daniel's voice was quiet, but it had a weight to it I hadn't heard in years. She turned to him, her mouth opening to spin another web, but he just shook his head. "Don't. Just don't." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my 64 years on this earth. Over at the bar, Robert's colleague caught my eye and I gave him a tiny nod. He went back to his drink. Courtney's whole perfect persona started to fracture right there in front of us, like old glass that finally gives way under pressure. She started throwing out excuses and half-truths, trying to paint herself as the hero who was just looking out for our family's assets. Daniel didn't say a word. He just looked at the papers, then at me, and then at the woman he'd married. He looked like a man who had been following a map his whole life, only to realize all the landmarks were fake. When Courtney finally stood up to leave, I had one last thing to say. "The shop isn't a transaction, Courtney. It's my wife's legacy and mine, and it's going to stay with people who actually respect that. My lawyer will be calling yours next week." She didn't say another word. She just turned and walked out, and the door closed behind her with a finality that felt like a weight being lifted. The winding down. Daniel and I sat there in the quiet for a long time. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. 18 months, I told him. He looked down at his hands, ashamed. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because I needed you to be able to look her in the eye without a mask on," I said, "and because I had to be 100% sure before I blew your life apart." "You were protecting me," he whispered. "I was protecting your mother's work," I corrected him. "And yeah, I was protecting you too." He sat there, processing it all. The clock. She really left a letter in there 8 years ago? She did. She had a feeling. She wasn't sure, but she made sure I'd be ready. Daniel ran his hand over the fruitwood case of the bracket clock. "She was always 3 steps ahead of the rest of us, wasn't she?" "Always," I said. "That was just Miriam." We sat there for another hour, not saying much, just being together. Eventually, we walked out into the cool Asheville night. The downtown lights were glowing in that soft way they do when autumn starts to settle in. We stood by our cars for a second, and Daniel looked at me with eyes that were finally clear. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he said. "You've got nothing to be sorry for," I told him, gripping his shoulder. "You trusted your wife. That's not a character flaw, Daniel. That's just love. The fault lies with the person who takes advantage of that trust." He put his hand over mine, just like his mother used to do, and we said our goodnights. I drove back to the shop, parked in the alley, and carried the clock back inside. I put it right back on the shelf where Miriam had left it 8 years ago. I wound the movement since it had stopped while I was out, and I just stood there in the dark, listening to that steady, rhythmic tick fill the room again. In the weeks that followed, the legal dust settled pretty quickly. Courtney's source at the insurance office was fired, and the law firm she'd been working with sent over a formal letter saying they were backing off any deals involving my property. Marcus had done such a good job with the evidence that there wasn't even a fight. They just folded their cards and walked away. Daniel filed for divorce in November. He told me later that Courtney didn't even try to contest it. I think that was the first time they'd been honest with each other in a long, long time. And as for the shop, the gears are still turning, and the time is still being kept, exactly the way it was meant to be. Daniel ended up moving back into that little house he owned before he got married, a quiet spot on a side street not too far from the shop. It wasn't long before our Sunday morning ritual started back up. The first Sunday he returned, he showed up with 2 coffees and a bag of pastries from that bakery over on Haywood. He stood there at the front counter just like he did when he was 15 years old, waiting for me to open up. I didn't make a scene or demand an apology. I just turned the key and let him in. We didn't breathe a word about Courtney that morning. Instead, we talked about a complicated cuckoo clock I'd taken in from an estate sale, the kind of job that was going to take me a solid month just to disassemble. We talked about the weather and some movie he'd seen. It was just the 2 of us, relearning the rhythm of being father and son after a long, cold season apart. Learning the craft. 2 weeks later, I sat him down and taught him how to clean a clock movement for the first time. Now, being an engineer, he wasn't exactly a natural at it. He tried to move too fast, wanting to solve the machine instead of taking the time to understand it. But he sat there at the bench with me for 2 hours, his phone ignored on the counter, learning how to be patient with something small and precise. I watched him slowly come back to himself with every careful turn of the screwdriver. By the end of the afternoon, he looked at the finished movement, all clean and ready to tick, and whispered, "Mom used to do this, didn't she?" "She did," I told him. "And truth be told, she was better at it than I ever was. Just don't go telling the neighbors that." He laughed then, a real, genuine laugh. It was the first time I'd heard that sound in what felt like a lifetime. The worth of a legacy. I want to tell you why I'm sharing this. I didn't spend 18 months documenting and preparing just so I'd have a story to tell at the bar. I went through all that because what Miriam and I built together was worth protecting. It wasn't about the dollar value of the building or the inventory. It was about what it represents. It represents 38 years of 2 people showing up every single day and putting their hearts into their work. You have to understand that greed doesn't usually announce itself with a shout. It arrives politely. It asks reasonable questions and makes you feel like a paranoid old fool for even noticing. The people who love you for what you own rather than who you are will always find a way to make their interest sound like concern. They'll ask about your health or your retirement plans, and they'll wait for you to start believing that your life's work is just a number on a page. Don't let them do it. Watch for those early signs. Keep your own records. Put your trust in the people who show up without an agenda and love you without doing the math first. And if you've got a good attorney, keep them close. The best time to build your defenses is long before you actually need them. Time keeps moving. My name is Victor Hale. I'm 64 years old. Most days I fix broken clocks and watches, but every once in a while, if I'm lucky, I get to help hold a family together. Miriam left me that clock with a secret tucked inside and told me I'd know when the time was right to open it. She was right. She was always right about the things that mattered. That bracket clock is still sitting right above my workbench and it runs like a dream. Miriam's restoration work was, as always, absolutely flawless. I wind it every Sunday morning before Daniel pulls into the alley, and I sit there listening to it tick, steady, certain, and counting out every hour we still have left together. You see, some mechanisms, once they're properly cared for, will keep running for a long, long time. If this story meant something to you, leave a 2 in the comments so I know you stayed with me until the end. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. Sometimes the right words have a way of finding the people who need them most.